The young and the restless spoilers. Damian's lifeless body was the final answer to a question that had haunted Genoa City for weeks, a mystery that had silently slithered through whispered conversations, anxious glances, and late-night confessions. He was the corpse that had been alluded to again and again, the body that now bore the weight of everyone's sorrow, regret, and unanswered questions. When his name was finally confirmed, when it was no longer just a nameless death but Damian, it wasn't just a tragedy, it was a seismic fracture in the already fragile foundation of several lives. For Lily, the revelation hit with the weight of 10,000 shattered promises. The man she had laughed with, confided in, and perhaps even loved in some strange, unspoken way, was now cold in a Parisian morgue, his face no longer lit by possibility but frozen in a haunting stillness. She couldn't breathe. She couldn't think. The noise of the world around her had collapsed into a deafening silence, broken only by the racing thoughts that refused to let her sleep. She blamed herself, though she wasn't sure why, maybe because she hadn't stopped him from going, maybe because she had encouraged the trip in the first place, or maybe simply because grief demands a culprit, and guilt is often the easiest target. Life, in its cruel and relentless forward march, refused to pause for mourning. Genoa City moved on, but Lily could not. Her days became rituals of barely suppressed sobbing, of avoiding the mirror because she couldn't stand the sight of her own eyes, swollen with tears and shadowed with regret. Everything reminded her of Damian. The park bench where they once shared coffee and cynical jokes about love, the back offices of Chancellor Winters where he had stood too close, and even the silence in her house, which now echoed differently, more hollow, more cruel. And while Lily's grief was internalized, quiet and consuming, Amy's was fire and fury. The moment she received the call, the sterile voice on the other end informing her that her son was dead in a foreign country, she let out a scream that cracked the stillness of her home. Damian was her child, her boy, her heartbeat. He wasn't supposed to die before her. He wasn't supposed to die at all. Ignoring the late hour, the jet lag, the paperwork, and the protocols, Amy flew to Paris under the cloak of night, propelled by a primal need to see her son, to confirm with her own eyes what she refused to believe in her soul. But the moment she arrived, everything became too real. The fluorescent lights of the morgue cast a sickly glow on Damian's body, now tagged and catalogued like some forgotten stranger. Her hands trembled as she reached out to touch his cheek, expecting warmth and finding only death. There were no answers, no suspects, no reasons. Just a zippered bag and a mother's screams. She demanded to know who had done this, but there was no one to arrest, no one to accuse. Only Cain. Because Cain had been the architect of the night that killed her son. He had arranged the party, had curated the guest list with the precision of a man trying to reinvent himself through spectacle. It was meant to be a celebration, a rebirth of sorts, for his business, for his public image, perhaps even for his soul. But what had begun as a glamorous event ended in the cold corridors of death. Cain hadn't killed Damian, not with his hands, but Amy couldn't shake the feeling that he might as well have. He had invited those people, those strangers, those dangerous variables from every dark corner of the globe, all converging on Paris with secrets and vendettas. He had turned Damian's last night into a roulette wheel of risks. And Damian lost. Now Cain stood at the center of a storm he couldn't control. Once a man known for his charm and calculated control, he now looked like a ghost himself. Haunted, sleepless, and deeply aware that the blood on his hands might not wash off, even if the law cleared him. The media circled like vultures, the whispers in the business community grew louder, and friends began to fade away, unwilling to be collateral damage in the scandal. But Cain didn't fight the shame. He accepted it, perhaps because he knew that somewhere deep down, Amy's rage wasn't misplaced. He had gambled with fire, and someone else got burned. Damian's death cast a shadow that stretched beyond grief. It was a storm cloud over the entire city. Every person who had attended the party became a potential suspect. Every camera angle, every champagne glass, every disappearing guest became a piece of a puzzle no one could solve. The police combed through the scene with surgical precision, but the answers remained elusive. There were rumors of an argument, whispers of a weapon, but no motive, no witnesses, no closure. The longer the case went unsolved, the more theories emerged. Some said it was a crime of passion, others whispered about corporate espionage gone wrong. And a few suggested that perhaps Damian wasn't the intended target at all. But none of these answers mattered to Lily. Because none of them brought Damian back. And worst of all, none of them could explain why the writers of this tragic tale, life, fate, the cruel hand of a soap opera god, had chosen to kill off Damian at all. What was the point? Why kill a character just as he was beginning to matter, just as he was anchoring himself into the lives and hearts of others? Was it for shock value? For ratings? Or was there a deeper purpose, some moral arc that had yet to reveal itself? Perhaps the writers had intended this death to shatter the illusion of safety, to remind viewers that no one is immune to the consequences of their secrets. Or perhaps Damian's death was not an end, but a beginning. A spark that would ignite a dozen new fires, a dozen new lies, a dozen buried truths. Because Genoa City does not mourn in silence. It reacts. It implodes. It exposes. And in the wake of Damian's death, no one would be left untouched. For now, Lily stands at a crossroads. She can crumble, or she can uncover the truth. Amy, meanwhile, refuses to go back to her old life. She wants vengeance, not justice. She wants someone to pay. And Kane. Kane knows that redemption will cost him everything, and he's not sure he has anything left to give. But what no one realizes is that Damian may have left behind more than grief. He may have left behind secrets, emails, recordings, hidden alliances that could blow apart the fragile alliances holding Genoa City together. The silence around his death may not be a dead end, it may be a trap, a test, or a warning. And as the lights dim on this chapter, a new one waits in the shadows. Darker, more dangerous, and soaked in the blood of a young man whose story ended too soon, but whose legacy may be just beginning. Let me know if you'd like to continue this story, explore who the killer might be, or develop new arcs for Lily, Amy, or Kane. Amy's grief had long since boiled into rage, but rage alone was no longer enough. Damian was dead, and in her mind, Kane's face was the last thing standing between her and justice. But Amy wasn't just a grieving mother blindly hurling accusations into the void, she knew something. Deep within the trembling wrath of her soul was a conviction rooted in more than emotion. Kane Ashby was not just a careless host of a deadly party. He wasn't just a man covering up a scandal. He was a fraud. A liar. A puppet dressed in the name of Aristotle Dumas, masquerading as a man more powerful and more dangerous than he truly was. And Amy, who had watched from afar, who had heard whispers in private corridors, who had read between the lines of Damian's final messages, was now convinced that Kane was not the man he claimed to be. The real Dumas, she believed, had yet to show his face. Kane was the smoke, the misdirection, the well-dressed decoy shielding a much darker force. This belief didn't just fester in her mind, it erupted. In the dim light of Damian's cold funeral reception, Amy cornered Kane in a back room, her hands trembling, her jaw clenched with fury and sorrow. She demanded answers, spitting accusations like venom, pushing him into a corner until finally, blinded by rage, she wrapped her fingers around his throat and squeezed. For a moment, the air vanished from Kane's lungs. Not from the strength of her grip, she was older, and her fingers shook, but from the conviction behind it. She meant to hurt him. She wanted him to feel the weight of the son she lost, the weight of every unanswered question. But even as his face darkened, as security burst through the door and ripped her away from him, Amy knew it wasn't enough. Choking a man wouldn't bring Damian back. What she needed was evidence. Irrefutable, damning evidence. And that, terrifyingly, was the one thing she didn't have. Because as it stood, the crime scene told a very different story. The fingerprints found on the weapon didn't belong to Kane. They didn't belong to Amy. They didn't even belong to any of the most obvious suspects from that cursed Parisian soiree. Instead, the prints belonged to someone no one had ever heard of, a name that didn't appear on the guest list, didn't show up on surveillance footage, and had no clear connection to Damian or anyone in his orbit. The police were baffled. The media latched onto the mystery. And for Amy, it felt like her worst nightmare had materialized into a cruel game. The murder wasn't a spontaneous act. It was a message. Carefully staged. Coldly calculated. Someone had wanted Damian dead, not just for personal reasons, but to set off a chain reaction, to pull on the threads of power and deception until the entire city unraveled. And that's when Amy realized the full magnitude of what she was facing. This wasn't just about Kane. This was about a hidden hand moving pieces across a chessboard of chaos. Kane, for all his arrogance and theatrics, may not have even known the full extent of the role he was playing. He was a pretender, yes, a man eager to wear the mask of Aristotle Dumas and bask in the fear it inspired. But Amy suspected now that even he didn't truly know who was behind the curtain. The real Dumas was still out there, watching, waiting, orchestrating. And whoever they were, they had already proven themselves capable of murder. Amy began retracing her son's steps in the days leading up to his death. Damian had been nervous, erratic even, but he hadn't confided in her. Not directly. However, in his final voicemails and journal entries recovered from his cloud account, there were clues, scraps of paranoia, warnings veiled in metaphor, and a cryptic note about the voice that wears another's name. That line haunted her. It seemed to confirm what she feared, that someone was hiding in plain sight, using Kane's image to build a network of influence and fear. As she dug deeper, she discovered financial irregularities connected to the Dumas brand, offshore accounts, sudden shell company activity, and encrypted transactions that pointed not to Kane, but to someone using his access. Someone who had the sophistication to launder power through reputation. But Amy hit wall after wall. The more she investigated, the more doors closed. Her phone was tapped. Her emails were tampered with. Journalists she tried to enlist suddenly grew cold, citing threats or losing interest without explanation. Even the local police began distancing themselves, murmuring about international jurisdictions and forces above their pay grade. It was clear, the conspiracy ran deeper than she'd imagined. And Kane? Kane played the role of the embattled businessman beautifully. He went on television expressing regret over Damian's death, offered financial support to Amy's foundation, and maintained a carefully worded innocence in every interview. But Amy could see the cracks. The way his eyes shifted too quickly when pressed about details. The way he refused to answer whether he had ever spoken directly to the real Aristotle Dumas. And worst of all, the way he seemed to fear someone, every time he thought no one was watching. He wasn't in control. He was afraid. Which meant Amy was getting closer. But fear works both ways. One night, Amy returned to her hotel to find the door ajar. Nothing was stolen, but someone had left a single item on her bed, a white envelope containing only a single photo, Damian, standing at the Paris party, smiling, with a shadowy figure blurred in the background. On the back of the photo, scribbled in a rushed, unfamiliar hand, were the words, "He was never the target." Amy's blood ran cold. If Damian wasn't the target, then who was? And why had he been killed instead? Her mind raced. Was Damian collateral damage? A witness to something he shouldn't have seen? Was Kane meant to die that night? Or someone even higher in the chain? Was this entire murder a warning to someone else? Or worse, was it a message to her? The deeper Amy fell into the web, the more tangled it became. Every clue led to another shadow, another dead end. But her resolve only hardened. She didn't care how high the conspiracy went, or who she had to expose. She would find the real Dumas. She would force him into the light. And if Kane truly was a puppet, she would rip the strings from his back and make him confess. Even if the whole world tried to stop her. Because Amy Lewis was no longer just a grieving mother. She was the reckoning. And she was just getting started. Would you like to continue this story into the next phase? Perhaps where Amy allies with someone unexpected, or where the real Dumas finally surfaces.